Well, when I got done, there was a fourth grader. His name is Jeffrey. He came up to me, looked at me deadpan, and he said, I have a piggy bank at home, and I'm going to help you with my pennies. And I thought, what can a fourth grader do? Anyways, 6 weeks later, Westside School had raised 62,340 pennies. And when you think about it, it wasn't celebrities, it wasn't sports stars, it wasn't adults, it was children reaching out to children halfway around the world, and they did it with pennies. So what can a penny buy? What can a penny buy in Toronto? Maybe half a pencil, or I don't know what you can buy with a penny in Canada, but a penny can buy a pencil in Afghanistan or Pakistan or even in Africa. And a pencil is not that important, but what education does, though, it empowers community and it gives children hope. And if you have hope, you can do anything. So from that meager drive, we now have a program called Pennies for Peace. And for lack of better words, it's kind of going bananas lately. Last year in Canada, it was in about 25 schools. This year, it's in 350 schools in Canada. And in the US, it went from 278 schools to 4,900 schools in last year. Now, one reason is because the National Education Association, some librarians, they helped write a whole curriculum for that. And also, we have components about learning from our elders and about math and many other lessons. And before I go on to, I'd like to just go back to the beginning. The one question that I ask students, I visit about 150 schools a year, public and private and rural and urban, and I always ask students, how many of you have spent a lot of time talking to your grandparents about the Depression or World War II, or in Canada, do you know how the maple leaf got on the flag before it was a Union Jack? Or in Canada, 1972, remember what happened when Canada played Russia? There was 8 games in the Olympic or hockey games. Anyways, in Canada, about 20% of the students put their hand up and say they've spent a lot of time with their elders. In the US, it's only 10%. But the same question in Afghanistan or Pakistan, 90 or 100% of the hands come up. And I think it's one of the greatest tragedies of our countries. We've lost the tradition where we can learn from our elders. It's about our folklore, our culture, our heritage, our traditions, and many of the important lessons that we've learned in history. So one thing we do in our schools is we have elders come in 2 or 3 times a week and do storytelling so that the children really can learn from their elders. And I think it's the one negative thing about literacy and education is it often eradicates the storytelling tradition. These are very wise traditions, especially in indigenous cultures, where they can learn from their elders, and it's something that we really need to nurture. So our Pennies for Peace program has many components. As I mentioned, it's learning from our elders, math, and everything else. But one other thing we encourage kids is to go out on their own and start something. I'll just give you one example. This young man, his name is Zach. Zach is from Tampa, Florida. Zach did Pennies for Peace for a few years, but 2 years ago, he saw some homeless kids in the Tampa area. Now, Zach is he's only 12 years old. How old are you about? 12? 9? She's 9. So Zach did Pennies for Peace about 9 years old till he's 12. But one thing bothered Zach is he saw some homeless children in the Tampa area. So he started a charity or nonprofit called Little Red Wagon Foundation. Last year, Zach walked from Tampa to Washington, D.C., 800 kilometers with his Little Red Wagon. He raised $78,000 to bring awareness to homeless kids in the U.S. This year, during his summer holidays, Zach is going to walk from Tampa, Florida to Los Angeles across the United States, like, Trans-Canadian Highway, which I think is even further. And he is going to raise $1 million to bring awareness to homeless kids in the U.S. Well, when Zach set up his charity to get licensed, he called me up and he said he needed some board directors. And he said, these are like board people or adults? And I said, no, Zach, it's like a moral compass and fiduciary responsibility. And Zach said, could I put some children on my board? And I said, I don't think there's any law against it. So today, all of Zach's board directors have to be under 18 years of age to be on Little Red Wagon Foundation board. Well, in '94, I went back to Pakistan. I had the school supplies. But when I got to Corfe village, Haji Ali first greeted me. He said, Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be with you. And then he shook his head and he said, Cheezale. Now, being from the Midwestern U.S., the best translation I can think of the word Cheezale is what the heck. You know, he said, you know, we didn't think you're coming back. And we have to appreciate, there's no phone there, there's no mail, there's no texting, there's no twittering or whatever all that stuff's called. Anyways, he said, we didn't think you're coming back, but if we really want to build a school, we have to build a bridge first. So I hadn't thought of that. So I came back to the US, I raised $10,000 more. I went back in 1995. In 1995, they built about a 100-meter long bridge. There are 5 steel cables holding this bridge that weigh about 400 kgs each, that they carried 25 kilometers up the mountain trails on big wooden spools. Can you imagine that, just carrying those big loads to get this bridge built? A phenomenal engineering feat. So does anybody want to hear a love story? In 1995, September 13th, I was 38 years old. I was a bachelor. I was working as a trauma nurse. I was in graduate school studying neurophysiology, which is epilepsy. I also want to get the school built. I was at a fundraising dinner. It was getting kind of late, so I walked to the back. There was a very beautiful woman in the back, and she was dressed with black combat boots. So I started talking to her, and 6 days later, we got married. Now we're living happily ever in Montana with our 2 children. And we started the first of many visits to Pakistan and Afghanistan with our family. It's been a great joy to share our family with the people in those 2 countries. Tara, also my wife, I think she's a saint, and she's the real reason I'm able to do this. She's also a very practical woman. One day I was typing some fundraising letters. By then I learned how to use a computer. It was about 2 in the morning, and Tara came over and said, honey, what are you doing up so late? I said, well, I've got to get these letters written. And she looked over and she said, Greg, those letters are all the same. I said, yes. She said, have you ever heard of cut and paste? Anyways, that day I got all the letters out the door, thanks to my wife, Tara. So I kept working and working on the school, but you can see 3 years later, we hadn't gotten very far. And actually the problem wasn't them, it was me. And I was doing something in Canada or the US that we call micromanagement. I had my plumb line, I had my receipts and the records, and I was determined to get the school built. Well, one day, Haji Ali, he noticed my frustration. He took me aside. He said, if you want to get a school built, you have to sit down and be quiet and let us do the work. He took my receipts, he took my plumb line, he took my records, he locked them up in a little earthen locker along with his holy Quran and prayer beads. And then he came back and said, Inshallah, meaning Allah willing, everything will be fine. Of course, I was horrified, and guess what happened 6 weeks later? The school got built. And he brought me a record book in the old British accounting system, a ledger with all these thumbprints in it, but it's a way for illiterate people to keep track of all their expenses. And they had accounted for every single rupee that had gone into the school. Now, this is on a micro scale, but you can also apply this on a macro scale. And one of my main criticisms about the reconstruction policy in Afghanistan, it was started at the Bonn Conference in December 2001, and 24 countries got together, including the US and Canada, and they decided how to rebuild the country. But they set it up as a centralized, deprovincialized type of system. Now, some of you here might remember after World War II something called the Marshall Plan. There was Canadian architects involved also. I've studied the Marshall Plan. It was a brilliant plan, and the architects who designed it were genius. But the main component of the Marshall Plan is that it was provincialized and decentralized. And in Afghanistan, we completely flipped that around. Only the last couple of years have we really started to change that around. Also, what I learned from Haji Ali is that we need to get communities involved. So today, all our schools, you know, a building and brick and mortar is not really important at all. It's about teachers and teacher training. That's the real heartbeat of education. We provide the skilled labor, the materials, and teacher training, but the community, they have to provide free labor, free resources, free land, 2,000 to 5,000 days of free manual labor if they want to get a school built. And what that does is it ensures the local buy-in and viability and sustainability of a school. Well, the school got built. I decided in '96 to dedicate my life to doing this, and what happened is I had a fatwa issued against me. Now, a fatwa means an edict. A fatwa can mean a good thing, or it can be a negative thing. And in my case, the fatwa was banishing me from Pakistan because I was helping girls go to school. So I went to Syed Abbas Rizvi. He's the head imam or religious leader in northern Pakistan. He's a very powerful man, but he's also a very wise and visionary man. And I said, Saeed Saab, whatever you decide, I respect your decision.